This is the JHS Colour Box, and it is probably the cheapest, most flexible 1073 style preamp you can buy. And as much as I'd like to buy 8 of them to put on all the mics on my drum kit back here, I still can't really afford that. And plus, I don't want to buy all the cabling and build a special enclosure to house 8 of these things. But there's still a way to use the Colour Box on every track in a mix without having to buy 8 or 16 of them. And I'm gonna show you how to do it. Then we're gonna take that mix that we mixed with the Colour Box and compare it with a mix that's just using plugins. And we're gonna see if it's really worth all the extra effort to use the Colour Box as a virtual console plugin. But first, I'm gonna play some drums. So while it'd be nice to take all 8 mics I have here on my drum kit and run them into their own separate Colour Box, I don't have the money to do that. But I can use the Colour Box as a hardware plugin to affect every track that I record in my project. A hardware plugin is basically when you take any piece of hardware like a guitar pedal or a rack unit like a compressor or an EQ, and you wire it up to your interface so you can use it like a plugin in your DAW. So instead of dialing in your setting on your hardware and then recording through that and then into your project all in the recording phase, a hardware plugin allows you to use that hardware anytime during the mixing phase, just like you would any plugin in your DAW. But because you're using a physical device, you have to make physical connections on both your interface and your hardware in order for that to work. Now, without getting too technical, the Colour Box is a great pedal preamp option because it has this little switch on the side, which is an instrument XLR switch, which allows you to toggle between instrument level and line level signals in the Colour Box. Since most inputs and outputs on an interface like this are line level, see line level inputs, line level outputs, this makes it so we can use the Colour Box with this interface without having to use what is called a reamp box, which takes a line level signal and converts it to an instrument level signal. With the Colour Box, we can just take an output on our interface and run it into the XLR input of the Colour Box, but we're gonna need some weird cables. Yes, the only way to use line level with the Colour Box is to use the XLR input. I know this is a combo jack that can take a regular instrument level and an XLR, but in order to use the line level, you have to use an XLR. So we have to use this weird cable, which is a XLR male to TRS male. So the TRS end is going to go into an output on the back of our interface here. And side note, it's important to remember which outputs and inputs you're going to use, because this will come in handy later when we're actually in the software or DAW. So I'm going to go out of line output 4, and I'm going to go into the Colour Box here. So we've made a connection going out of the interface into the Colour Box, and we have our line level switch engaged. So now we need to get signal going out of the Colour Box back into our interface. So again, we have to use sort of a weird cable. This is an XLR female cable to a TRS male cable. So we're gonna go out of the Colour Box XLR output, and we're going to go into any of these free inputs on the back of the interface. And just to keep it consistent, we're going to use input 4 into our interface. So just to visualize this a little better so we know exactly which connections are being made where, we have our output going out of our interface, and that's going into the Colour Box here. And then we're going out of the Colour Box into our input here. And we're using output 4 and input 4. So let's go into the DAW and show exactly how this gets routed in there. So here I am in my DAW, and I've got all my drum tracks that I just recorded, and I know that I want to use the Colour Box to mix all these drum tracks. Currently there's nothing on these tracks at all, no plugins whatsoever. So let's say I want to start with the kick drum. So I know that I want to get this kick drum out of my DAW, out of my interface, into the color box, out of the color box, back into my interface, so I can use the color box like I would any other plugin to mix these drums. So how am I going to get this kick drum out into the color box? Well, I know that I am running out of my interface, output 4, into the color box. So I could take my outputs, which are right here, and say output 4, and then I know that the input that is coming from the color box is input 4. So I could just go and make a new track and use input 4, which you see right here, which is the color box return, and I could monitor that track. And then, so I have that track monitored. So let's play these tracks and see what happens. The kick drum from the color box, which currently isn't turned on, back into this new track. I could call that C-Box Kick. But now I've got two kick drum tracks. I've got the original one up here, and then I've got the color box return track right here. There is an easier way to do this. There's a plugin in my DAW, which is Studio One, called Pipeline, and essentially that handles all the routing for you. So if I place this on the kick drum, I can select output 4 and select input 4. And now I don't even need this color box return track here. I can just remove that. And you can see I'm getting both output and input into my color box here. Now the tricky thing is that most DAWs have a utility plugin like this, but they're different for each DAW. Here in Studio One, it's called Pipeline. In Ableton, it's called External Audio Effect. In Logic, it's called I/O plugin. They all do the same thing, but as with any DAW, the interface is different. The other thing I should say is that you need to know how things are routed with your interface in your DAW. So the nice thing about this Pipeline plugin in Studio One is that it has this little auto button. And what that does is it sends a little blip of audio out to your hardware, and then it sends it back in, and it shows you the waveform, and it shows you if it's in phase or not. So you can see that these waveforms are showing that it is actually in phase, which means that you will have no latency issues. You can see that it calculated an offset here, and it's 72 samples or 16.15 milliseconds. In addition, it also lets you dial in your return signal, so how much signal is coming out of the color box back into your interface. You can make sure that your gain from the beginning to the affected signal back in is going to be the same. So one thing to keep in mind with the color box with gain is that there are essentially 5 different places where you can adjust gain. There is the 20 dB pad on the side, which I'm actually using because if I don't have that enabled, my signal's way too hot going into the color box. So I have the 20 dB pad enabled. And then you have the high-low switch here, which basically means that high is going to drive the preamp a little bit more and low is going to give you more headroom. And then you have your step gain, which is basically stepping up your gain by a number of decibels per step that you're on. And I think there's 5 of those. Then you have your pre-volume, which is basically the volume going into the preamp after your step gain. And then you have your master volume, and that is basically your master output volume going out of the color box back into the interface. I keep the master volume cranked all the way up to the top, and then I kind of adjust my step gain and my pre-volume just to make sure that I'm getting a decent signal, and then I start messing with EQ after that. So I'm going to loop this section. I'm going to go into solo on the kick drum to begin with, and then I'm going to listen in context. So let's hear that kick drum with the color box and then without the color box. Great, so I've got a kick drum sound dialed in and I'm ready to move on to the snare drum. But there's a problem. Now I could put the same pipeline plugin on my snare drum and start mixing the snare drum, but now I've got two things going to the color box. So I'll be mixing both the kick drum and the snare drum because this is hardware. It doesn't just affect one channel at a time. It affects everything that's going to it. So if I'm happy with this kick drum sound, I have to now print that kick drum sound to my project, which basically means it's going to take this entire track and it is going to do what's called bouncing it down to a new track. And in Studio One, that's pretty easy. I can just right click on this kick drum track and then go to Event and then bounce to new track. But you're going to see what happens when I do that. It's got to play through the entire track. Again, it's like using a plugin, but it's not a plugin because it physically has to go through the hardware and then print the track back into the project. And if you want to use the color box on every track in your session, you're going to have to do this for every track, which basically means sitting here and listening to what is going to be 2 minutes and 20 seconds over and over again while I bounce tracks down. Is it worth it? I don't know. I guess we'll find out when we use plugins at the end and compare the two. Still bouncing. Still bouncing the track. After the track is bounced, it gives you a new track called Kick. And then your old track here is Ghosted. And I can actually just hide that track so it's not confusing me by just clicking up here. And now I've got that color box affected kick drum in my project. Now, another thing that makes this sort of complex is recall. So with plugins, when you open up your project, you have all of your plugins in the same state they were when you closed out. Of course, with hardware, it doesn't save that state unless you have, motorized things, and the color box doesn't have motorized things. There is a solution though for recall, and it's old school, but you can take a picture of your settings, and I'm just gonna drag and drop it right in here. That's really big. So I dragged and dropped my picture into Pipeline, and then when I click on it, it opens up. And so I can use this as a reference. So if you want to save this as a preset, store preset, we'll call it Color Box Kick. It's in my presets, and you can do that across all of your tracks, and it gives you a good starting point. So that's basically how it works. You would do that for any track that you have in your session, and then you basically have a virtual color box console for all your tracks. Now, it does take a little bit more time, but we're going to do a comparison here at the end and see if it's worth it to use the color box as a virtual console. So I've mixed two versions of this song, one completely with the color box and the other one using a 1073 style Neve plugin, and we're gonna see how they compare. Now I should say for the bass tracks and the guitar tracks, I didn't actually EQ anything with the color box. I just simply ran it through to get that preamp effect, and I did the same thing with the plugin version. It's just I put the plugin on it. I didn't actually tweak anything else. On the master bus, I have the SSL bus compressor. I have bass room to kind of tame the low end, and then I have the ozone limiter to just bring the volume up. So let's take a listen and let me know in the comments what you think. think it really comes down to taste and workflow. I understand that using the Colour Box takes a lot more time, it takes a lot more effort to just get that whole thing set up and going. I think it sounds great on some things. I think maybe I need a little bit more practice with other things. I think using a plugin might be the answer a lot of the times just because it's a lot faster. But I do feel like using the Colour Box is really awesome because it does make me use my ears and it does bring something sonically to the tracks that I haven't really found in a plugin. Anyways, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to get back to you. I hope you enjoyed this video. I certainly enjoyed putting it together, and I will see you in the next one.